I never thought my own mother would look me in the eyes and tell me, without a hint of hesitation, that my life was worth less than my sister's. I was sitting at the dinner table when it happened, a fork halfway to my mouth, spaghetti dangling from the tines. My mom's voice was eerily calm, as if she were asking me to pass the salt, not demanding I undergo life-altering surgery. "You have to do this," she said. "Her life is more important than yours." My fingers clenched around the fork. I set it down slowly, staring at her, waiting for her to laugh, to say it was a joke. But she didn't. She just met my gaze with the same quiet resolve she always had whenever she made up her mind about something. Mom had always favored my sister, Rachel. It was an unspoken truth in our family, something I had learned to live with. If Rachel wanted the last cookie, she got it. If she needed help with her homework, Mom would sit with her for hours while I figured mine out on my own. If we both got sick, Rachel got the warm soup and tucked in blankets while I was handed a box of tissues and told to rest. I had accepted it, mostly. It hurt, sure, but I convinced myself it didn't mean she loved me any less. Maybe just differently. But this was something else entirely. Rachel was sick. She had been diagnosed with end-stage kidney failure 3 months ago. The doctors said she needed a transplant and fast. Everyone in the family had been tested, and I was the only match. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "I don't understand what you're saying." Mom exhaled sharply, as if I were being deliberately difficult. "Rachel is younger. She has more potential. She's going to college next year. You've always been different. Less ambitious, less driven. Rachel has a future. You wouldn't let her die, would you?" My chest tightened, a sharp sting of betrayal cutting through me. So because I'm not some straight-A prodigy, my life isn't as valuable? Mom shook her head, looking exasperated. "That's not what I'm saying. But you know Rachel has always been special. You have a chance to save her life. Isn't that what family does?" Family! The word felt hollow coming from her lips. I turned to Dad, hoping for some kind of support. He sat stiffly, his hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on his plate. He had always been the quiet one, the peacekeeper. But this wasn't just about keeping the peace. This was about my body, my life. "Dad?" My voice wavered. "Do you think I should do this?" He hesitated. That hesitation alone told me everything. "It's your choice," he said finally. Mom scoffed. "Oh, come on, Richard. She's being selfish. Rachel is dying, and she has a chance to save her. What kind of person says no to that?" I felt my heart pound against my ribs. A person who's scared. A person who isn't ready to have her body carved open just because you think she's less important than Rachel. Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. Rachel, sitting across from me, had barely said a word. She had been quiet since the diagnosis, her once bright personality dulled by exhaustion and pain. Now, she finally spoke. "I don't want to die," she whispered. The words sliced through me like a blade. I looked at my sister, her face pale, dark circles under her eyes. She was always the favorite, always the one everyone adored, but she was still my sister. And she was scared. Tears burned my eyes, but I blinked them away. "I don't want you to die either," I said softly. Mom jumped on that immediately. "Then do this. Do the right thing." But was it the right thing? I didn't know. All I knew was that my mother had just told me my life didn't matter as much as my sister's, and I wasn't sure I could ever forgive her for that. The tension in the room was suffocating, pressing down on my chest like a weight I couldn't shake off. My mother's eyes burned into mine, full of expectation, of silent demands. My father, still frozen in his seat, refused to look at me. And Rachel looked exhausted, fragile, like a gust of wind could knock her over. But that didn't make my decision any easier. "I need to think," I said, pushing my chair back. My voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. Mom scoffed, shaking her head. "Think, what's there to think about? Your sister is dying and you can save her. What kind of person needs time to think about something like that?" A lump formed in my throat. I wanted to scream that it was my body, that I wasn't just a spare part to be harvested, but I knew that no matter what I said, she wouldn't understand. Without another word, I stood and left the table. I heard my mother mutter something under her breath, followed by the sound of Rachel softly crying. I didn't stop walking until I was in my room, the door shut firmly behind me. The moment I was alone, my legs gave out and I sank onto my bed, my head in my hands. What was I supposed to do? If I said yes, I'd be going under the knife, giving away a piece of myself. Would I regret it? Would I wake up in pain, knowing I had been pressured into something I wasn't ready for? But if I said no, would I be able to live with myself if Rachel didn't make it? I lay back, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning. A soft knock on my door made me sit up. I expected my mother, ready to guilt-trip me into compliance. But when the door cracked open, it was Rachel. She looked even smaller than usual, standing hesitantly in the doorway. "Can I come in?" she asked. I nodded. She slipped inside and closed the door behind her. For a long moment, she just stood there wringing her hands. Then, with a deep breath, she said, "I'm sorry." I blinked. For what? For everything. Her voice wobbled. For Mom. For making you feel like you don't have a choice. For being the favorite. I let out a hollow laugh. It's not your fault she treats you differently. Rachel sat on the edge of my bed, pulling her knees to her chest. I never wanted that, she whispered. I never wanted to be the one she put on a pedestal. I hate it. I hate that she's doing this to you. I swallowed hard. You heard what she said, Rachel nodded. I did. I didn't know what to say. I don't want to take this from you if you don't want to give it, she continued, voice barely above a whisper. I know what Mom thinks, but I don't agree with her. I don't think your life is worth less than mine. And if you don't want to do this, I won't hate you for it. Tears pricked my eyes. I had spent so long resenting Rachel, thinking she was the one reaping all the benefits of being the golden child. But now, sitting here, she just looked tired, lonely, as trapped as I felt. I don't know what to do, I admitted. Rachel reached over, taking my hand in hers. Then don't let Mom decide for you. I squeezed her hand. For the first time that night, I felt like I could breathe. But the battle was far from over. I didn't sleep that night. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying my mother's words over and over again. Her life is more important than yours. How could she say that? How could she believe that? No matter how many times I tried to rationalize it, tried to make sense of the way she had always put Rachel first, this was different. This wasn't about giving up a toy or stepping aside so Rachel could have the spotlight. This was my body, my choice. Wasn't it? By the time the sun rose, my decision still wasn't clear. But I knew one thing. I needed space. I needed to get away from that house, from my mother's expectations, from the weight pressing down on my chest. I grabbed my jacket and slipped out before anyone else woke up. The morning air was crisp, biting at my skin as I walked aimlessly down the quiet streets. My feet carried me to a small park a few blocks away. I sank onto a bench, my breath visible in the cold air. How was I supposed to make this choice? If I gave Rachel my kidney, I'd be forever tied to this moment. There'd be scars, physical ones, emotional ones. Would my mother expect even more from me after that? Would I always be the spare part, the one who had to sacrifice? And if I didn't do it, would I be able to live with myself if Rachel didn't make it? I pulled my knees up to my chest, burying my face in my arms. I was so lost in my thoughts that I didn't hear someone approaching until a familiar voice broke the silence. I figured I'd find you here. I lifted my head. My best friend, Jonah, stood in front of me, hands shoved into the pockets of his hoodie. He wasn't smiling like he usually did. His face was serious, his dark eyes scanning mine. "How did you know I'd be here?" I asked, my voice hoarse. He shrugged, sitting down next to me. "You always come here when you need to think." I let out a soft laugh. Guess I'm predictable. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he studied me, as if he could see every storm raging inside me. "So," he said finally, "I heard about the transplant." I stiffened. "Who told you? Your mom?" "Of course she did." I groaned, pressing my palms against my eyes. "Let me guess. She called you and asked you to talk some sense into me. Something like that." His voice was careful, measured. "She made it sound like you were just being difficult." I let out a bitter laugh. "Of course she did." Jonah exhaled, leaning forward, elbows resting on his knees. "Look, I'm not here to tell you what to do. That's your choice. But I do think you need to talk to someone who isn't emotionally invested in this." He hesitated. "Have you talked to a doctor? Like, Not just about the surgery, but about what it could mean for you. I blinked. I hadn't really thought about that. The doctors had only talked to my family as a group, never to me alone. No, I admitted. Jonah nodded. Then maybe you should. For the first time since this nightmare began, something in my chest loosened. He was right. My mom had framed this as an obligation, something I had to do. But if I talked to a doctor alone, I could get real answers. Not just about the risks of surgery, but about the long-term effects, about what this would mean for my health, for my future. Yeah, I murmured. I think I will. Jonah smiled, nudging me with his shoulder. Good. And whatever you decide, I've got your back. I felt something sting behind my eyes, but I blinked it away. Thanks, Jonah. For the first time in days, I felt like maybe, just maybe, this decision could actually be mine. When I got back home later that afternoon, I was expecting another confrontation. I was prepared for my mom's accusations, her guilt-tripping, maybe even more pressure from my dad. But the house was eerily quiet. Too quiet. I stepped inside and heard soft voices coming from the kitchen. Mom and Dad were talking, their voices hushed, urgent. I lingered in the hallway, listening. She has to do it, Richard, my mom was saying, her voice low but firm. Rachel doesn't have time. I don't know why she's hesitating. Dad sighed heavily. Maybe because it's a major surgery? Maybe because she's scared. She doesn't have a reason to be scared. She'll be fine. People donate kidneys all the time. She's being selfish. Selfish. The word sent a sharp pang through my chest. I clenched my fists, breathing through the anger rising inside me. How could she say that? How could she act like this was just some minor inconvenience for me? I stepped into the kitchen, and both of them turned to look at me. My mother's face hardened immediately, as if she knew I had heard everything. I want to talk to the doctor, I said, my voice steady. Alone. Mom narrowed her eyes. Why? What do you need to ask that we haven't already covered? I forced myself to keep my voice calm. Because this is my body, and I need to understand what this means for me. Not just Rachel, not just you, me. Dad exhaled, rubbing his forehead. That's reasonable. Mom shot him a sharp look, but didn't argue. Instead, she crossed her arms. Fine, she said tightly. But don't expect the doctor to tell you anything different than what we already know. Rachel needs this. There's nothing else to discuss. Except there was a lot more. 2 days later, I sat in a doctor's office alone for the first time since this all started. Doctor Patel, the nephrologist, was kind, patient. She answered every single question I had, even the ones that made my stomach twist. Yes, kidney donation is generally safe, but it's still a major surgery, she said. There's always a risk of complications. And in the future, if you ever have kidney problems, you'll only have one left. That could put you at higher risk for long-term health issues. I swallowed hard. So if something happened to me later in life, like kidney disease, an accident, I'd be at a disadvantage. She nodded. That's true. It doesn't mean you will have issues, but it's something to consider. I took a deep breath. And if I don't do it? What happens to Rachel, doctor? Patel's face softened. If she doesn't get a living donor, she'll have to rely on the transplant list. It's unpredictable. Some people get a kidney in months. Others wait years. It's not an easy road, but it's not impossible. Something inside me shifted. All this time, Mom had made it seem like Rachel would definitely die if I didn't do this, that she had no other options. But that wasn't entirely true. Yes, it would be harder, and yes, it was a risk, but it wasn't the death sentence Mom had made it out to be. I left that appointment with a mixture of emotions, relief, guilt, anger, but most of all, I left with clarity. This wasn't as simple as my mother wanted it to be. This was my choice, and for the first time, I felt like I actually had one. That night, I sat across from my parents, my hands clenched into fists under the table. Rachel was upstairs, too exhausted from dialysis to join us. I've made my decision, I said. Mom's entire body went rigid. Good, she said, a note of victory in her voice. We'll schedule the surgery, I shook my head. No, I'm not doing it. Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. Then, my mother laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. You can't be serious. I met her eyes. I am. You're really going to let your sister die? She spat, her voice shaking with rage. She won't die. She can go on the transplant list. She has options. Mom slammed her fist against the table. No, she doesn't. You are her option. You are her chance, and you're being unbelievably selfish right now. There it was again. Selfish. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I am not being selfish. I have the right to make decisions about my own body. She's your sister, Mom hissed. She would do this for you. I let out a bitter laugh. Would she? Or would you pressure her just like you're pressuring me? Mom's face turned red. She opened her mouth, but I didn't give her the chance. For once, I'm making a decision for myself, and I need you to accept it. She pushed back from the table so hard that her chair scraped against the floor. You are not my daughter. Her voice was cold, unrecognizable. My stomach twisted. What? She shook her head, eyes blazing. You're a coward, and you are not my daughter. My father flinched, his expression pained. Linda? But Mom was already storming out of the room, leaving behind a suffocating silence. I sat there, staring at the place she had been, my heart pounding in my chest. I had made my choice, and I had just lost my mother because of it. I sat there staring at the empty space where my mother had been, her last words echoing in my ears. You are not my daughter. The air felt thick, heavy, pressing against my chest. I thought I'd feel relief after making my decision, after finally standing up for myself, but instead, all I felt was this crushing, suffocating weight. Dad was still sitting across from me, rubbing his temples like he was trying to make sense of everything. He had been silent through most of the conversation, like always. Dad, I said quietly, my voice hoarse. Do you think I made the wrong choice? He exhaled slowly, his fingers interlacing on the table. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then he looked at me, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with something else. Something sad. I think, he sighed, shaking his head. I think there was never a right choice for you. Not in your mother's eyes. His words hit me harder than I expected. I swallowed the lump in my throat. But what do you think? He hesitated, then reached for his glass of water, his hands trembling slightly. I think you're brave. That surprised me. You do? He nodded. Your mother, she doesn't see things the way you do. I bit my lip, trying to push down the sting of his words. I know. His gaze met mine. That wasn't fair to you. Something inside me cracked. All these years, I had convinced myself that maybe I was imagining it, that maybe my mother did love me the same way she loved Rachel, just in a different way. But hearing my father acknowledge it, say it out loud, made it real. I clenched my fists under the table. Do you think she meant it? I whispered. What she said? Dad's face tightened. She was angry, hurt. But no, I don't think she meant it. I wanted to believe him, I really did. But deep down, I wasn't sure if that was true. The days after my decision were tense, unbearable. My mother refused to speak to me. If she was in the room when I walked in, she would leave. If I tried to talk to her, she would act like I wasn't there. At first, it stung. Then, it just made me angry. I wasn't the villain here. I wasn't the one who had asked for this situation to happen. I wasn't the one who had decided that my life was worth less than my sister's. I wasn't the one trying to tear this family apart. Rachel, on the other hand, tried to bridge the gap. She would knock on my door at night, hesitating like she wasn't sure if I even wanted to see her. Can I come in? I always let her. I'm sorry about Mom, she said one night, curling up at the edge of my bed. She's scared. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. So am I. Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line. I don't want to be the reason this family falls apart. You're not, I said immediately. Mom is. She flinched and guilt twisted in my stomach. I reached for her hand. Rachel, I love you. But I had to make this decision for me. I know, she whispered, and I don't blame you. That night we sat in silence, side by side, neither of us knowing what came next. It took a week for my mother to finally explode. I was in the kitchen making a sandwich when she walked in. At first, she ignored me, opening the fridge and pulling out a carton of milk. But as she turned to leave, she stopped. She didn't look at me. You could have saved her, she said, her voice cold. I gripped the counter, inhaling sharply. She's not dead. She might as well be. I spun around, my chest tightening with fury. How dare you say that? Mom finally turned to face me, her eyes sharp, filled with something that made my stomach turn. "She's on borrowed time," she said. "She's getting weaker every day. And when the time comes, when she's too sick to even move, you'll regret this. You'll hate yourself for this." My hands clenched into fists. "No, you will hate me for this. And you know what? That's fine. But I'm done hating myself just to make you happy." Her jaw tightened. "You're a selfish, ungrateful child." A bitter laugh escaped me. "And you're a terrible mother." Her eyes widened, like she couldn't believe I had said it out loud. But I wasn't done. "I spent my whole life wondering why you never loved me the way you love Rachel. And now I finally understand. It's not about her being better than me. It's about you needing to control everything. You don't love Rachel more. You just love having someone to mold into exactly what you want." She was breathing hard now, her grip tightening around the milk carton in her hand. "Admit it," I said, my voice shaking. "If the roles were reversed, if Rachel was the match for me, would you force her to do it?" She didn't answer, and that silence told me everything. I nodded, stepping back. "I hope one day you realize what you've done." Then I left, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. I didn't know what was going to happen next, but I did know one thing. For the first time in my life, I was free. I left the kitchen, my heart pounding in my ears. My mother's silence after my question had said everything I needed to know. She would have never asked Rachel to do this for me. That thought alone should have destroyed me, but it didn't. Instead, it gave me a strange sense of peace, like I had finally seen the truth for what it was. No more illusions, no more, "maybe she loves me differently," lies I had told myself for years. I was done chasing a love that wasn't there. But just because I had made my decision didn't mean things were suddenly easy. For the next week, my mother barely spoke to me. When she did, her words were clipped, calculated to cut deep. "You'll regret this," she muttered one morning as she passed me in the hallway. I didn't respond. That was her new tactic, not fighting, but making sure I knew exactly what she thought of me. Every sigh, every glare, every moment of silence was another reminder that in her eyes, I wasn't worth anything anymore. My father, as always, tried to stay neutral, but I could see the exhaustion in his face, the way he avoided being in the same room as both of us at the same time. Rachel, though, was different. She tried to keep the peace, but she also refused to let me feel guilty for my decision. One night, she knocked on my door and slipped inside, sitting on the edge of my bed like she used to when we were kids. "Mom's being awful," she said quietly. I let out a short laugh. "You think?" She bit her lip. "I know this is hard for you." I looked at her, really looked at her. Rachel was sick. That part hadn't changed. Her body was getting weaker, the disease slowly wearing her down. She was paler, thinner, her hands trembling slightly as she played with the hem of her sweater. But she was alive, and she still had a chance. "Have you heard anything from the transplant list?" I asked. She hesitated. "Not yet." I swallowed the guilt creeping up my throat. "I hope you get a match soon." She nodded. "Me too." Then she hesitated. "But I need you to know that if you don't, I don't blame you." My chest tightened. I didn't realize how much I had needed to hear that until she said it. Rachel gave me a small, sad smile. "I know Mom wants to act like you're the villain here, but you're not. I don't want you to think that." I blinked rapidly, trying to push back the sting of tears. "Thanks, Rach." She reached over, squeezing my hand. For once, we weren't just the favorite daughter and the disappointment. We were just sisters. I should have known it wouldn't last. A week later, my mother made her final move. I was coming home from school when I saw her in the living room, sitting stiffly on the couch, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Something about the way she looked at me sent a chill down my spine. "What?" I asked, dropping my backpack by the door. She took a slow, measured breath. "I've spoken to an attorney." My blood ran cold. "About what?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "About you." I stared at her, my heart pounding. "What the hell are you talking about?" She exhaled sharply, like she was disappointed I wasn't understanding fast enough. "You're 18. You're legally an adult. And if you refuse to be part of this family," her voice cracked slightly, but she quickly recovered, "then maybe it's time you leave." I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. "You're kicking me out?" She didn't flinch. I'm giving you a choice. You either step up and do what's right for this family, or you leave. I laughed. It was a hollow, broken sound. You're unbelievable. She stared at me, waiting. Waiting for me to break. Waiting for me to beg. But I didn't. I took a deep breath, letting it settle into my bones. Then I nodded. Fine. Her eyes flickered with something, shock, maybe, or fear, that I had actually called her bluff. I'll leave, I said. If that's what you want, I'll go. She hesitated. You don't have to. No, I cut her off, my voice steady. You made your choice, and I just made mine. I turned and walked up the stairs, ignoring the way my hands trembled as I started packing my bags. By the time I was done, my dad was standing in the doorway, his expression pained. Where are you going to go? I swallowed hard. I'll figure it out. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, but then he just sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. I'm sorry. I should have been angry at him. Maybe I was, but mostly I was just tired. I know, I said, and then I left. The first night was the hardest. I crashed at Jonah's place, grateful that his family didn't ask too many questions. He had just given me a hug and a blanket and told me I could stay as long as I needed. The second night, I started looking for jobs. The third night, I let myself cry. Not because I regretted my decision, not because I missed my mother, but because it still hurt. Because even though I had always known she loved Rachel more, I had never really believed she would choose to throw me away. I wasn't sure where I was going next, but for the first time in my life, I was free. A year later, I got the call. Rachel had found a match. It wasn't me, but it didn't matter. She had the surgery. She was okay. She reached out a few months after that. We met for coffee, and for the first time, we talked like sisters. Not as the golden child and the forgotten one. Just two people trying to heal. Mom never called. Dad sent me a text on my birthday. I miss you. I never went back home. And maybe that was okay. Maybe some families aren't meant to be fixed. Maybe some wounds don't heal. But I had built something new, a life that was mine. And for the first time, that was enough.